They taught the class about Deathworld monsters. Unaware one was in the room, narrated from the perspective of Rael Osun, a Galactic Union xenobiology student. Let me tell you something about the Galactic Union Academy. It is, without a single drop of exaggeration, the most prestigious educational institution in 412 star systems. It accepts the brightest minds from species that have mastered faster-than-light travel, dimensional folding, and in the case of the Mavreni, the ability to photosynthesize emotions directly from starlight. And yet, nothing, absolutely nothing in the Academy's 700 years of operation had prepared it for the day Professor Dorath Sivine decided to teach Xenobiology 301 with a live specimen sitting 3 rows from the front. Let me back up. My name is Rael Osun. I am a Thulvari, which means I have 4 eyes, bioluminescent freckles that glow when I am nervous, which is frequently, and a nervous system so sensitive that I once fainted from the sound of someone sneezing too loudly. I mention this because it is relevant, very relevant, embarrassingly relevant, as you will soon understand. The course was called, with cheerful optimism, Introduction to Apex Predator Biology across known and catalogued death worlds. Professor Sivine had designed it himself after spending 20 years cataloging planets that tried to kill him. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, and had what the Academy nurse once politely described as a complicated relationship with adrenaline. We loved him. We were also mildly afraid of him. The semester had been genuinely wonderful up until that point. We had covered the carnivorous fungi of Drell 9, which hunted by mimicking the mating calls of whatever species happened to be walking by. We had studied the pressure-resistant predators of the deep ocean moon Uvek, creatures that could crush a standard-issue exploration shuttle with their resting grip. We had even done a week on the silicon-based ambush hunters of Krath, which were invisible to most known forms of electromagnetic detection and had the unsettling hobby of collecting the skeletons of things they had eaten. It was a good class, informative, occasionally terrifying, excellent for building character, assuming your character survived the viewing of the weekly specimen footage. Then came the unit on Earth. Now Earth had a reputation. That is putting it gently. Earth had a reputation the way a collapsed star has a gravitational pull, in that everything around it eventually got pulled in whether it wanted to or not. The Galactic Union had been aware of Earth for approximately 60 cycles. In that time, the planet had been classified, reclassified, debated, redebated, and ultimately filed under a category that did not officially exist in the Academy's taxonomy system but was informally called, by the xenobiologists who worked on it, "Please do not send field teams." The reason was simple. Earth was absurd, not hostile exactly. The planet was not trying to destroy you. It just happened to be the kind of place where the soil itself contained microorganisms that could infiltrate most known biological systems, where the weather could transition from pleasant to lethal within a single rotation, where animals that weighed several thousand kilograms roamed in herds so large they had historically altered the terrain they walked across, and where the apex predators at the top of the food chain had, over millions of years of evolution, developed the single most terrifying biological trait ever documented in the Union's history. They were patient. Not fast, not the strongest, not armored in impossible shell. They were patient. They remembered. They planned. They used tools. They made more tools to make better tools. They taught each other. And somewhere in that long, slow, grinding evolutionary climb, they had produced a species that looked, by all surface metrics, harmless. They called themselves humans. Professor Sivine had spent 3 lectures building up to humans. He had structured the unit like a horror story, which in retrospect was entirely appropriate. First week, Earth's general classification and why it met all 12 criteria for a Class 7 Deathworld designation. Second week, Earth's non-sapient apex predators, the bears, the great cats, the ocean giants, each one a creature that would have been the most dangerous thing on any other planet in its size category. Third week, the one we were currently sitting through, humans. "Pull up slide 4, Sivine said, standing at the front of the amphitheater-style classroom with the kind of energy that suggested he had been waiting for this moment all semester. The holographic display behind him shifted. What appeared was a creature standing upright on 2 limbs, bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, a visible lack of any obvious natural weapons, no claws to speak of, no venom sacs, no armor plating, soft tissue on the outside, completely exposed. It was wearing a colorful garment and appeared to be smiling. The class stared. "This," said Sivine, "is what the universe's most successful invasive apex predator looks like when it is in a good mood." Someone in the back of the class made a sound like air slowly leaving a pressurized vessel. "They have no natural armor," Sivine continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed a detailed anatomical breakdown. Their skin is thin enough that a standard agricultural tool from most of your home worlds could cut through it without significant resistance. Their skeletal structure, while relatively dense for a creature their size, is far below the durability threshold of the top predators on their own planet. Their senses are, by galactic standards, unremarkable. They cannot detect electromagnetic fields. They cannot hear frequencies above or below a very modest range. Their olfactory capability is frankly insulting compared to species like the Drevari, or even basic domesticated fauna on Chorus 4. He paused. And yet, he clicked again. The slide showed a graph. The graph showed, across a timeline of approximately 200,000 years, the complete and total domination of every ecological niche on an entire Class 7 Deathworld by a single species of soft, slow, lightly armored, moderate sensory primate. The class was very quiet. They did not survive by being the strongest, Savine said, and his voice had shifted into that particular register he used when he wanted something to sink in. They survived by being the most stubborn organisms in the documented history of biological evolution. Their bodies, when damaged, do not stop functioning. They have a pain response, yes, but pain does not incapacitate them the way it incapacitates most species. Their physiology enters a state that researchers have taken to calling persistence mode, where non-critical systems deprioritize and the organism continues to operate toward its objective regardless of sustained injury. Keth Marvo, who sat 2 seats to my left and was a Drevari with the fur color of someone who had not slept well in several days, raised one of his 4 upper limbs. How long can they persist? Documented cases, Savine said, and he actually smiled, which was a sign you should be worried. Include an individual who was struck by a ground vehicle moving at significant speed, stood up, walked to a nearby structure for assistance, and did not lose consciousness until after reaching help. Another individual was recorded finishing a competitive athletic event on a fractured lower limb. Another continued fighting, and I use that word deliberately, a significantly larger predator for several minutes after sustaining injuries that would have triggered full shutdown in any of the species represented in this room. The silence in the classroom was the kind that had texture to it. You could feel it pressing against your eardrums. And then from the 3rd row came a sound. It was very soft, very human. The kind of sound a person makes when they are trying extremely hard not to laugh at something that is being said about them in a room full of people who do not know they are there. Half the class turned. Sitting in the 3rd row in a seat that she had occupied since the first day of the semester with a data pad on her knee and a drink container in her left hand that had gone cold approximately 40 minutes ago, was Mara Voss. She had enrolled in the academy as an exchange student under the new union integration program. She had been in our year group for 6 weeks. She had in that time been perfectly pleasant, consistently helpful during group projects, occasionally funny in a dry way that took a moment to register, and absolutely completely unremarkable in the way that very competent people sometimes appear unremarkable right up until the moment they are not. She was also, as the class was only now realizing, a human. Vrail, meaning me, stared. My bioluminescent freckles, which I mentioned glow when I am nervous, lit up like a navigation beacon. Mara looked at the slide on the display. She looked at Professor Savine. She looked at the class looking at her. She took a very deliberate sip of her cold drink. Sorry, she said in Galactic Standard, with an accent that now sounded completely different knowing what she was. I was trying to hold it in. The part about the pain response, I mean. That is a very clinical way to describe something we just call being too annoyed to stop. The room did not move. Professor Savine turned from the display very slowly. His expression went through several phases. Surprise, recognition, something that looked almost like professional delight. Miss Voss, he said. Professor Savine, she said. You have been sitting in this class for 6 weeks. I have. You did not feel it relevant to mention at any point during the first 2 weeks of Earth content that you were yourself from Earth. She tilted her head slightly, the way humans do when they are considering whether to be honest about something. I thought the presentation was going really well. I did not want to interrupt the flow, and that, as I will tell you with complete sincerity, was the moment I understood that the xenobiologists were not exaggerating even slightly, because that response, calm, dry, delivered with a small smile while sitting in a room full of species who had just been told she was an organism that functioned on pain, outlasted apex predators, and had conquered an entire death world through the power of sustained, determined stubbornness, was possibly the most terrifying thing I had ever heard in an academic setting. Savine stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the class. And that, he said, is what the literature refers to as social adaptability. The lecture had approximately 40 minutes remaining. Mara Voss sat in the 3rd row. She finished her cold drink. She took notes. She raised her hand twice to answer questions about human biology, both times politely correcting minor inaccuracies in the academic sourcing. My freckles did not stop glowing for the rest of the session. Not even a little bit. The class did not end the way classes are supposed to end. Normally, Professor Sivan would wave a hand. The holographic display would collapse. Students would gather their data pads, exchange brief complaints about upcoming assessments, and shuffle out into the corridor in a loose, disorganized stream. It was a comfortable ritual. Predictable, safe. That day, nobody moved. Savine had clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed thermal imaging comparison between a human and a Vreth mountain stalker, one of Earth's large feline predators. The graphic was meant to illustrate heat distribution during sustained exertion. It was a perfectly normal academic slide, but the class was no longer looking at the slide. Everyone was looking at Mara Voss. Mara, for her part, was looking at her datapad. She had pulled up what appeared to be a set of revision notes, and was scrolling through them with the focused expression of someone who had a secondary assessment due by end of cycle and was not planning to let an entire amphitheater of stunned alien students derail her study schedule. Keth Marvo, sitting 2 seats from me, leaned slowly in my direction. His fur had shifted to the pale-colored Dravari Go when they are processing something that does not compute. He whispered, in a voice that was absolutely not quiet enough. "She has been here this whole time." "Yes," I whispered back. During the session on human persistence responses, yes. When Savine showed the footage of that individual continuing to function after the ground vehicle incident, Kaith. She watched that footage, in this room, with all of us, and she said nothing. "I am aware, Vrail." She clapped during the discussion segment. I had no useful response to that, because he was right. During the second week of Earth content, when Savine had opened the floor to discussion about what evolutionary pressures might produce the human physiological profile, Mara had contributed 3 separate observations, all of them insightful, all of them framed in the detached, academic language of someone analyzing a subject they found intellectually interesting, which, it turned out, she was. She had been analyzing herself, clinically, in front of witnesses. Savine let the silence run for another moment, which was a technique he used deliberately. He was a man who understood the educational value of discomfort. Then he said, "Miss Voss, would you be willing to field questions? In the interest of academic accuracy." Mara looked up from her datapad. She considered this in the way that humans visibly consider things, with a brief stillness that lands somewhere between a pause and a decision. "Sure," she said, "though I should mention that I am one data point, not a representative sample. Individual variation in humans is fairly significant." "Noted," said Savine, and he gestured at the class in the way that meant the floor was open. For a moment nobody moved, which was remarkable given that the room contained 63 students from 19 different species, most of whom were enrolled specifically because they could not stop themselves from asking questions about things that frightened them. It was, arguably, the defining characteristic of xenobiology as a field of study. Then Pelly Dune, a Sarath student in the upper tier of the amphitheater who was small enough to sit comfortably inside most species' carry luggage, and had the social confidence of someone who had never once in her life considered that a question might be unwelcome, raised all 3 of her arms simultaneously and said, "The slide says humans voluntarily return to environments that have previously caused them harm. It calls this a behavioral anomaly. Is that accurate?" Mara nodded slowly. "That depends on context. Can you be more specific?" Pelly pointed at the display where a subsection of the current slide listed documented human behaviors classified by Union researchers under the heading, Irrational Re-Exposure Patterns. The list included things like returning to natural disaster zones after evacuation, re-engaging with predator species after surviving an initial encounter, and in one notation that had caused significant academic debate at the time of its documentation, voluntarily swimming in the same body of water where a large aquatic predator had previously attempted to consume the individual in question. Mara read the list. Something moved across her face that was very close to a smile but was working hard not to become one. "Okay," she said. "So, some of that is practical. If your home floods, you go back when the water recedes because it is your home. The infrastructure is there. The community is there. Leaving permanently is often not a viable option. That is less irrational and more resource-constrained." She scrolled down the list. "The predator re-engagement thing is more complicated. Some of it is research. Some of it is that humans have a documented cognitive response to surviving a dangerous encounter that researchers have not fully agreed on a name for, but which roughly translates to, the fact that this thing almost killed me means I want to understand it better." She paused. Which, honestly, is probably why half of you are in this class. The room shifted, not physically, but something in the atmosphere changed, in the way that atmospheres change when a room full of people realizes they have just been accurately described. Savine made a note on his own datapad, which he rarely did during student-led exchanges. A sign, if you knew him, that something useful was happening. Zor Halveth, a massive Briggs student who took up a seat and a half and had chosen xenobiology because, as he had once explained during introductions, he came from a world that had no dangerous fauna whatsoever and found the concept philosophically incomprehensible, raised a broad gray hand. The course material says human groups historically competed with each other for territory and resources with significant lethality. How does your species manage cooperative behavior given that history? Mara looked at him for a moment. Have you met any other species? Zor blinked slowly, which was how Brigg processed an unexpected conversational redirect. Yes, then you have already answered your own question. Every cooperative species in the Union has a history of internal conflict. Humans are not unusual in that respect. We are perhaps unusual in the speed with which we transitioned from small competing groups to large coordinated ones. But the mechanism is not mysterious. We are social animals. The same drives that made us competitive within groups made us intensely loyal to the groups we belong to. Scale the group, and the loyalty scales with it. She tilted her head. Usually, Zor repeated. We are still working on it, she said, in a tone that was completely flat and somehow deeply reassuring and deeply alarming at the same time. I had been quiet up to this point because my freckles were still glowing, and I was hoping nobody would call on me and that I could slip out at end of session and process everything privately in my dormitory with the lights off. This was not an unreasonable plan. It failed. Mara looked directly at me. She had the kind of eyes that humans have, forward-facing, high contrast, built for tracking moving objects at distance, and when they focused on you there was a directness to it that felt, to a Thalvari with 4 eyes accustomed to the more dispersed gaze patterns of most species, like being selected. You have been glowing since I laughed, she said. My freckles immediately intensified. This was not helpful. Yes, I said. Are you frightened? The honest answer was complicated. I was not frightened the way I had been during the footage of the silicone ambush hunters on Krath. That had been a sharp immediate fear with a clear object. What I was feeling sitting in a room with Mara Voss, knowing what I now knew about what she was something more layered. It was the fear of realizing that your model of something was fundamentally wrong, and that you had been operating on incorrect assumptions without knowing it. It was the fear, specifically, of not knowing what else you had assumed incorrectly. I am recalibrating, I said. Mara looked at me for another moment. Then she nodded. Once, in a way that felt like she understood exactly what I meant, possibly better than I did. That is fair, she said. For what it is worth, I am not actually dangerous. By human standards, I am fairly average. I do not have any unusual training or capabilities. I am a student. I find xenobiology interesting. I thought joining the exchange program would be a good experience. And is it? Pelly Dune called from the upper tier. Mara glanced upward. It is getting more interesting, she said. Savine let the questions run for another 20 minutes. By the end, the room had loosened considerably. Keth Marvo's fur had returned to its normal coloration. Zor Halveth had asked 4 follow-up questions, each one progressively less alarmed and progressively more genuinely curious. Pelly Dune had asked whether she could interview Mara for a personal research project, and had received a yes contingent on her sharing the finished paper. When Savine finally released the class, he kept Mara back for approximately 3 minutes. I know this because I moved slowly packing my things, which I am not ashamed of, and I could hear the tail end of their conversation. Savine said, in a voice that was quieter than his lecture register. You could have mentioned it at the start of the unit. And Mara said, you could have checked the enrollment list. There was a pause. Fair point, said Savine. The slides are mostly accurate, by the way, she added. The section on pain management undersells it a little, and the bit about endurance thresholds is using data from non-athletes. The actual ceiling is higher. Another pause, longer this time. I will update the source material, Savine said. I can send you references, Mara said. I left before I could hear the rest, mostly because my freckles had finally started to dim and I did not want to re-trigger them. I walked out into the academy corridor, which was wide and high-ceilinged and filled with the ambient sounds of several dozen species moving between sessions, and I stood there for a moment trying to decide how I felt about the last 2 hours of my academic life. Here is what I concluded. The Galactic Union had spent 60 cycles categorizing Earth as a deathworld and its dominant species as an anomalous apex predator of unusual durability and behavioral unpredictability. The xenobiology literature had produced over 40,000 peer-reviewed papers on human physiology, psychology, social structure, and evolutionary history. The Academy had built an entire semester-long unit around explaining what humans were and why the universe should pay attention to them. And in all of that time, across all of that documentation, across every thermal imaging slide and endurance case study and behavioral anomaly notation, not a single paper had adequately captured what it was actually like to sit in a room with one. It was not the strength, it was not the persistence response, it was not even the patient, grinding, stubborn endurance that had made them the last species standing on a planet that had tried for millions of years to produce something that could beat them. It was the fact that Mara Voss had sat in Xenobiology 301 for 6 weeks, listened to an entire academic unit about what she was, answered questions about herself in the calm, measured language of a person who found the subject genuinely interesting, and at the end of it all, offered to send Professor Savine better reference material. That was the thing the literature had not figured out how to write about yet. Humans did not find it frightening to be studied. They just wanted to make sure you were getting the data right. I sent Mara a message that evening. It said simply, "I have some questions. Not for a paper, just for myself, if that is all right." She replied in less than a minute. "Sure, I am free after the second meal period. Bring snacks if you have them. I have been told humans are easier to talk to when food is involved, and honestly that one is accurate." I did not know whether to laugh or update my personal threat assessment log. I brought the snacks,